Deneen from Dearborn, Michigan, Tara from Richland School District 1, I'm assuming that's South Carolina. Correct me if I'm wrong. And if any of the rest of you have joined in, please, in the questions section, share who you are and where you're from. Just love to know the audience. So thanks for joining us today. I love this conversation. I love spending time discussing what is educational equity, why does it matter, especially because it tends to be addressed in a rather abstract or kind of a conceptual sense. But educational equity is very concrete. It is actually about the experience of the student every single day. And feeling especially engaged in this conversation today, I was just at a school district here in Utah, Canyon School District. And the crazy thing with it, it's the school district that I attended growing up. And first time I've ever been in that situation. And it was really unique because I built my own understanding of educational equity based upon my personal experience in my K-12 education. And so to be there, meeting with all their principals, with their district leadership staff, discussing what is equity, was honestly quite a moving experience. And understand as well, from a background perspective, Jordan School District, when I went there, this is to give a bit of background on myself, I was the same racially, religiously, socioeconomically as at least 90% of my teachers and probably 95% of the other students in the school. I was the norm. And so as I went through school as a white male, this is growing up in a suburban town in Salt Lake City, Utah, so almost everyone was Mormon, my teachers were the same. And I was the third in my family to go to that high school, so I was the third to be a student body officer, the third to be in honor society. I was expected to succeed. I only would have provided surprise to anybody if I had not succeeded. And the reason why I share that is because it wasn't till later, really getting into my own career in examining educational equity, when I started to understand that my experience was not exactly the experience of all the other students. And I had to go through quite a process to open myself up to the idea that school itself was designed to not work well for all students. It worked so well for me that I took it for granted. And so when we discuss educational equity, we have to bring to the forefront of this an understanding and awareness of difference. Students today are very different than any of us were. They're coming with far more diversity, far more needs. But our school system has not fundamentally changed, and the staffs in our schools, professional educators, tend to be people who liked school. School worked well for them. That's why they became an educator. So professional educators tend to have a strong bias towards schools working, just believing schools work. We got to tweak around the edges. But when we really get into this equity conversation, we then have to ask the question, what do we do when it doesn't work? And we can't turn towards how we experience school. Well, if students would just get their homework done better, if they would just focus more on their grades, if they just show up more often. We all did well at that. We fit within school. That's why we now work in education. We have to ask a different set of questions. What are the needs of this unique individual student? What structures are in place that are preventing this student from engaging at the same level that you or I might have engaged? And so as we go through this, it gives us a rich opportunity to seriously engage in building schools that work for all students. I'm excited about this work. I love this work. And it's because I'm biased towards schools working well. My career, my last 20 years has been traveling around North America and beyond, finding really excellent schools, documenting their work, writing about them, studying them. So I know these schools exist. So today's presentation, as David had described, is an introduction to Equity 101. I'm going to give you an equitable formula, or a formula for equitable success. This is introductory. In other programs, we're going to dive deeper into the equity framework and other components of this. But just to welcome our other members here, we have Kelly from the Florida Keys. Lucky you. If you ever need someone to come down and work with you, please let me know. We have Madeline from Detroit. I actually spent a lot of time working in Detroit. Very, very fascinated with Detroit and what's, the schools up there and what's going on right now. Tara from Columbia. Raul from Montreal. City I haven't been to, but really look forward to it. Je parle français, so greetings. And then Angela from Ballinger ISD in Texas. So really, we kind of represent almost every corner of North America. So this is exciting. Thank you so much for joining us. So jumping into this. As we discuss equity, this introduction to equity, I really want to emphasize this fact that equity really is about personalizing this learning experience for students. If we need to connect with 100% of students so that 100% of students are becoming highly engaged and finding success, then to do that, we have to start personalizing the experience. When I went through school, it was designed for someone like myself to succeed. It was not designed so that anybody could come in and find their path towards success. So that's a traditional school model. Equity demands of us that we shift this, so we start looking towards far more personalized learning experiences. We have to look at the culture and the practices and the leadership that is going on. And also Claire from Racine, welcome. So I want you to think about something here. We're not going to take a lot of time to deep dive in this, but it was an interesting exercise. And the reason I bring it up now is I shared this with the group I was with this morning. And so what I had them do is I wanted them to start to think about difference versus similarity. And so I had them identify their favorite teacher, a teacher who really impacted them, that just had changed the course of their own learning, their own direction in life. So I had them start with, well, what they learned. If this was such a remarkable teacher, what did they learn? So as I went through this myself, I listed Ms. Ensign. Ms. Ensign was my 12th grade AP English teacher. And she was the class where I just felt smart, highly engaged. I mean, I loved it. And so what did I learn in Ms. Ensign's class? Well, I learned a ton about 19th century British literature. I learned about discussions. I learned about symbolism. I learned how to think deeply, how to do deep contextual analysis. I was engaged every day. So as I took the educators this morning through this process, they identified their teacher's name. They discussed what is it they learned from this teacher. The next to that upper right quadrant, ways we were similar. So I had them write down ways they were similar. So for myself was Mrs. Ensign. Well, Mrs. Ensign, much like me, was white, was middle class. My parents were both professional educators. She was a professional educator. She shared the religious heritage that I was raised with. She was more liberal politically than the family that I grew up in, but I had liberal leanings, so I kind of connected in a unique way to her in ways that I didn't always connect with my own family. And so I connected with her. She got me, I got her. So as I took the educators through this, we then discussed that. How is it that you are similar to this teacher? Then we moved down into the lower right quadrant. How did this teacher show you that they care? And so as I really thought about Mrs. Ensign, as I went through this exercise on my own, well, she showed me she cared because when I showed up after school just to get into a quote-unquote deep discussion that meant a ton to me, she let me hang out. She let me stay there. She engaged in it. She listened to my thoughts. She would ask me questions about my thinking rather than challenging my thinking, you know, again and again. And I'm really kind of emphasizing this intellectual side that she brought, but, you know, she engaged me and she really set me up to go off to college feeling like I was prepared. So the group of educators this morning went through this exercise. They were describing, you know, now, how does the teacher care? And then we moved to the last quadrant, ways in which we were different. Well, as I think about myself and Ms. Ensign, again, I mentioned the political side. She was definitely more liberal-minded than the way that I was raised. So that was a difference. She was female, I was male. That was a difference. And so this group described this, but then I turned their conversation towards how did, you know, what was more impactful for you? The connection of your similarities or the connection of your differences? And without fail, this group of educators went to, it was those similarities that allowed them to connect. So this brings us right to today and the issue of educational equity today. We no longer have homogeneous schools. My school was remarkably homogeneous. And so I showed up to school, I fit already, I was normed. For me to connect with my teacher was expected. And so this is where equity really comes to the forefront, because today our schools are diverse, diversifying at incredibly rapid rates. You know, I look at some of the places you're from. I've worked in many of your towns. You know, I think about Detroit. Well, Detroit at one time was almost exclusively African-American students. There's a huge influx of Latinos into these schools now. And so that makeup of the students starts to change. And so what equity presents us with is, how do we build an environment where a student can come in remarkably different from the cultural norms that already exist in that school, but they can show up and they know they fit. The school is speaking to them, suggesting to them, yes, this is where you need to be. And so as I go through this equitable success formula, I really want you to think about those things. You know, today's conversation is more big picture. It's laying the foundation for diving deeper into some of the specifics around this work. So I shared with you this exercise because it's a great way to get your staffs or groups of educators reflecting in a very warm way on that teacher who meant so much to them, but then challenging that maybe the reason the connection existed was because there was so much similarity, which presents that question, how do we connect across these differences? So learning, it's personal. This is a picture here of my wife Melody and our beautifully wonderful children, Dominic, who's now 11, and Maya, who is 7. You can see from this photo that as a white father of black children, I'm being pushed into some areas that I don't know a lot about. You know, I look at this picture of my family and we are living today's diversity. And so it's a unique experience to adopt these two incredible kids, but then have to recognize I can't use the way I was raised to prepare them to succeed in the world. I have to step out of my comfort zone. I have to really ask, what does it mean to be the parent of a black child? There are different answers than asking the question, what does it mean to be a parent of a white child? I'm not suggesting anyone is more hard or whatever it may be, but it's different. So Melody and I, as we've gone through this experience, we've had to really challenge our own assumptions, our traditions, our cultural heritages, and ask the fundamental question, what is the environment we need to create so that Dominic and Maya feel secure within their own home, within this world they're growing up in? And I just share it because it's so relevant to the work that schools are doing today. And I have a personal need for this. If I don't figure this out, it's my own 2 children who pay the cost of my personal inability to shift, you know, to really learn how to accept this diverse world. They're the ones who pay the cost. Much like schools. You know, educators show up and they do an incredible job every day of getting the job done. But if every student's not engaged in a teacher's classroom or in a principal's school, The professional educator gets to show up the next day and continue to take the paycheck and continue to feel very rewarded for being a professional educator. It's the child who pays the cost for the educator's inability to shift towards a much more accepting kind of school culture of this diversity that's coming through the front door. I hope this makes sense. And again, I know this is a bit abstract in its construct, but it's really personal to the student who shows up and looks around and wonders whether or not this school gets them. That's deeply personal for the student. So equity is ultimately personal. So I'm going to share a quick story. I'm showing you images here of Dominic and an experiment that he did last year around building rockets. The reason I share it is that his engagement was intense. This was a project of his own choice. He had a report on it at school. There were no limitations on what he did. He got to choose 100%, which means his engagement was 100%. And he tested this rocket, and he tested this rocket. It was hours, and I'm there supporting him. And it took us about 12 launches to finally get this baking soda and vinegar rocket to launch properly. He wouldn't give up. So what does this have to do with equity? Well, Dominic owned this learning experience. He got to choose what the subject was. He got to choose how many times he kept trying. He knew there was only one measurement of success, and that was getting it to actually launch. He had the freedom to do it again and again and again, to practice, to refine every time so they could ultimately experience success. So that's me supporting my son for a project that he has to present to his class. But broaden this and think about it in a school environment. How often are we allowing students to really own their own work? To be able to choose the subject, to be able to choose the project, who they work with, the timeline involved. How often are we asking a student to, again and again and again, practice what they're doing until they reach mastery of the skill that they're working on? How often do we limit them and we say there's a fixed time frame here? You don't have time to complete this perfectly. And so all of this goes into this equitable environment, because as I think about educational equity, I have to think about the student's experience. And then expanding out, I think of the school. And so often as we address this, we start more from kind of the institutional perspective, and we try to modify the institution so that it works for all kids, but we don't spend as much time saying, what does the student actually show up with in terms of what they need? So as we go through this, I want to lay out for you a formula for success, a way that you can start tackling this. And as well as you have questions that come up and whatnot, or you want to send a message to me directly in the chat, please feel free. I'm monitoring this. This is live. I will see what questions you send me. So, School Improvement Network, the reason why we are discussing educational equity today is for the past 25 years, we have been traveling all over North America documenting highly effective schools, going in with a film crew, writing about them. We truly believe that if we can find examples of success where 100% of kids are engaged, we can study that, and we can pull out the key learning moments and share those with other educators. We don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. We really can learn from the best practice that's already being implemented out there. But we do have a bias towards actual implementation in the classroom. And so we search for schools that are highly effective. We document what they do. We validate that with the research, and then we share that out. So as I describe these environments, this really is based upon traveling around searching for those great schools. And I'm not sure how many of you have access to Edivate. Edivate is our online tool where we feature the videos and the learning and the pedagogical approaches that we document in these schools. And so everything that I'm describing today, we have examples of this. We have instructional components around it. And I would encourage you to go to Edivate to look for those, to learn from those. And if you need, email me directly. I can send you links towards some of these learning experiences and examples so that you can really learn from people already succeeding. So why do we do this? It really is about preparing 100% of students. So when I talk about these schools and I talk about 100% engagement, does that mean 100% of students are at grade level every year? No. But do I believe that we really can engage 100% of students? I do. I've seen it in reality too many times. So what happens when we have a student that is engaged? Well, an engaged student is one who learns. One who learns is one who makes progress. As long as they're making progress, they've got 13 years in their K-12 experience to be able to learn what they need to learn so that they're prepped to move on afterwards. And so our cause of 100% is really looking at that total student engagement. So I'm just going to click through this, and I'm going to present to you the Equitable School Success Formula. So what is the goal? The goal is actual equity. So how do we get towards actual equity? Again, I said this earlier. I'm not talking about an abstract concept around educational equity. I'm talking about real concrete results, concrete things that can be done every day in a school so that all students are engaged. So it begins with personalizing the learning. Spend a little time going into that. Then you have to factor in cultural proficiency. So it's one thing for me to modify the learning experience so it's oriented towards, or it's allowing each student to progress and engage in their own unique ways. It's another thing if I understand who the students are. I understand who they are racially, culturally, linguistically, economically. I understand who the student is, what their experience has been, what their cultural values and norms are, and I reflect that within their learning experience. That's cultural proficiency. So if I personalize the learning, but I don't make it reflective of who the student is, well, it's a technical exercise. But if I can personalize the learning and make it reflective of who that student is, and it honors who that student is every single day in every way, well, now I'm giving the student reason to care and then engage in better learning, in better personalized learning. But all this only matters if the implementation of these practices are successful. And so within this, you'll see that there's an element of the practice that occurs in the classroom. It's really that personalized learning component. There's an element of leadership, that successful implementation. And then culture is pervasive through all of this. So let's dive a little bit more into each of these components. So first, we need to define what is equity. And so as we go through this, and again, I would love to see your notes, your thoughts come in through the question or the chat box as we go through this. So I want you to focus in on the nouns within this. And so do a contextual analysis based upon where each of the nouns in this. So what is equity? Well, our definition of equity is that educators provide all students with the individual support they need to reach and exceed a common standard. So let's break this down. Begin with educators provide. It doesn't exactly say school districts provide. It doesn't say teachers provide or principals provide. It says educators provide. We're in this with a collective experience. Educators carry the professional responsibility to accomplish educational equity. We get more power in this effort when it is clear to all involved that educators hold the responsibility to guarantee the success of every student. We've been talking about this for years, but we continue to struggle in terms of its implementation. So educators provide. All students with. So educational equity is when a school environment guarantees engagement and success for all of its students. And this is students coming in with different racial backgrounds, with different language backgrounds. This is inclusive of white, middle-class, English-speaking students. You know, educational equity is literally about every student. You know, I posed the question this morning. So is it all students except for those with the IEPs? No, it's all of them. Is it all students except for those with 504s? No, it's all students. Is it all students as long as they speak English? No, it is all students. The school itself succeeds when truly every student is recognized. So educational equity. Educators provide all students with the individual support they need. So it's interesting here. There's a bit of a conflict in the language that I'm using. Because first I'm talking about all students, this big collective. But then I say that individualized support. We have to be aware of the entire group of students that are there. It is about all students. But for however long our traditional education methods have existed, the support that is provided is purely directed towards the norm of the students that show up. And so the support, the learning, the instruction, the connection has not been individualized. The system hasn't supported that. And so even though we have a lofty goal of all students succeeding, traditional forms of education leave off students. They just don't work for all students. Because when you direct it, you try to provide something for all students at once, well, it falls apart. And so the goal here is that all students experience educational equity, but the work we do in the classroom is focused on the individual needs of each student. So educators provide all students with the individual support they need to reach and exceed a common standard. So let's focus in on this standard piece. So the question which is always posed when I discuss this is, well, so how do we really measure success? Well, we already have those things out there. Standards exist in every school system that you listed here with where you're from. You have a set of standards. But as educators, we have confounded standards with curriculum. Standards are about performance. They aren't about what's taught. Now, a good curriculum is going to be oriented towards helping all students learn what they need to so they can turn around and perform to the standard. But the standard is fundamentally a goal. It's a measurement. It defines the performance we expect. So when we do that, when we expect all students to eventually reach a commonly held standard, that allows us to then individualize the experience for all students in their unique learning, their unique progress. And so you hold a high standard, and I expect every student to get there. But there are 1,000 ways to get there, and we're going to honor all those unique ways that students move forward in their learning. So that's a definition of educational equity that you can chew on and play with. So as we look at moving towards actual equity, well, we have that equity definition. When you have actual equity in a school, you really have true readiness for college, career, and society, a goal that all students deserve to attain. We are responsible for facilitating. So it really is about preparing students for the life beyond. So let's look at personalized learning. So personalized learning in this formula towards actual equity begins with the student's own readiness, interest, pace, and mastery, and then progresses from there rapidly forward. So personalized learning, if you think about this, I really want you to think about if we set a common standard of expectation of performance, then we recognize that the starting point for all students are different. Our traditional systems are set up so that it's assumed the starting point is the same, which means because students are uniquely individual, the ending point is different for all students. So we got to reverse that formula. The goal is the same, but we recognize every single day that where students are coming from, where they're starting from, is uniquely personalized to their own needs and readiness. So that's personalized learning. I have this example here of Dominic playing Angry Birds on an iPad. And I love this example because it really shows you how students naturally engage in personalized learning. And you're hearing my kids in the background. So if you watch a kid engage in a video game, and video games as a parent drive me as mad as any other parent. But what do I see in this? First and foremost, Dominic knows what the goal is. So he clearly understands what mastery in this game means. You got to win that level, right? It's purely self-paced. I'm not telling him you have 3 minutes to complete this level. It's 100% self-paced. He gets to drive his own progress and improvement. It's up to him. But then also practice is inherent within this. And so it's not just you have one chance to go out to learn and then show that you learned it. No, he gets to practice it 5 times, 20 times, 100 times if necessary in order to accomplish mastery. I love this example because it's just a simple way to think about what is the power of personalizing learning for students. Well, you're giving them a goal of mastery, you're allowing them to drive their progress through it, but then there's all kinds of freedom for practice, and you saw that in the example of that rocket ship as well. So this is a look at personalized learning. I'm going to jump through this. This will be a topic of another one. So what do we see, in personalized learning environments? I mean, I have this example of Nolan Middle School, how they formally introduced this. And so what Nolan did is they had this middle school hub, but then students, based upon their unique readiness levels, would be pulled out and would go towards either a math specialist or a language arts specialist. So half the time they're in this very mixed environment. Half the time they're learning with really good instruction based upon their own readiness level. This is different from a pull-out program or from leveling students, because at all times they're part of this larger group. They are part of the student cohort. So the instruction is focused on their need, but the student on their day-to-day experience is part of their entire class. It was incredible what Nolan pulled off. I mean, you can see here, 83% of the students at Nolan were experiencing at least 2 years of academic growth every single school year. I mean, imagine that. As such rapid progress in their learning. This is the power of personalized learning. So moving forward with this equitable school success formula, we're driving towards actual equity. The first piece is personalizing learning. The second piece is cultural proficiency. And I really think this element of cultural proficiency is one of the key pieces we have missed in this drive towards improving schools. So we tend to address cultural proficiency, relevancy, etc., as a nice-to-do thing that we like to do when we have time to sit back and think of the big picture, rather than thinking about cultural proficiency as defining my interaction every single day with my students. So cultural proficiency centers on the student's relevant background, heritage, culture, race, gender, values, community, family, interests, etc. In a culturally proficient school environment, the student sees him or herself reflected in the experience of school, sees his or her background honored by the school. Not honored in the sense of a Cinco de Mayo celebration, but honored in the way where every single day I get to show up and I see myself reflected in the learning. Now the challenge with this, and again I'm speaking as a white person in our society, my experience has been normed in the US. And so it takes effort on my part to step back and say, well, I have a whole classroom filled with diverse students. How do I change the experience so they see themselves within this? I can't turn towards my own interests, my own likes first. I first have to turn to the interests of the students themselves. I hope this makes sense. It's a major part of this. Personalized learning that doesn't reflect the cultural needs of the student or the cultural backgrounds of the student is a technical exercise. On the same note, a school who has great multicultural celebrations but has not personalized learning to needs of each student welcomes students but may not always challenge them to learn at the level they can. So these two really go well together. I have this example here, and this is an example that you can find on Edivate of the West Hawaiian Explorations Academy in Hawaii. This amazing environment, and I encourage you to look at it because it is so hands-on, it is so oriented towards the interests of the students. It's their daily experience. It's an awesome story. Please take the time to go and see it. So when we talk about these things, it's important to bring up how we've traditionally approached learning. And so this is really just an infographic to describe standards-based teaching, the way we've approached it. Learning in this scenario begins with the teacher who analyzes the standard, considers the curriculum that he or she has available, delivers that curriculum to the student, and then assesses them based upon whether or not the student has learned it. So that's a standards-based, a kind of straightforward standards-based approach. What's the challenge in this? Well, in this scenario, the teacher is the primary actor of the learning. The teacher is deciding what is going to be learned. The teacher is deciding the delivery method, which puts the student in a more passive position to receive the learning rather than an active one. So we have to shift this towards a more student-centered approach. And so in a student-centered approach, we begin first and foremost with understanding who the student is, where they come from, what their interests are, what their learning readiness is. And then we start looking at the different tools we can utilize in order to enhance that student's learning experience. So yes, we have to acknowledge the standards of proficiencies the student is expected to achieve. And so that weighs in on it. We also look at the tools and skills that a teacher brings, kind of their toolkit that they can apply at any time. We have to bring into this choice and accountability as well. We might want the student to work on a particular standard, but if the student chooses what they're working on the moment, immediately the student's engagement increases. And the beautiful thing, when you allow a student to choose what they're working on, they're far more receptive to the accountability on the back end of that learning. So rather than accountability being a punishment, accountability becomes a measurement of progress. But accountability only has that type of impact when choice is first involved in the learning. And this is where culture and relevancy comes into play. In the previous model, if I am too focused on how the teacher is going to deliver a standard to the student, the cultural relevancy pieces are referential at best. In this student-centered approach, well, I'm already studying the needs of the student, which means, at the first moment, I'm recognizing who the student is, where they come from, and how they are interested. The example that I often use is in terms of, a reading sample. So if I have students who are studying the Vietnam War, and I provide them a reading sample, well, they're going to read it kind of in a passive way. They're going to read it just to accomplish whatever question I'm asking them, to do. Versus if I expect the student, I say, go out and find someone in your community, in your family, who had served in Vietnam and interview them. Let's develop some questions to ask them. That activity, go into your community, find someone, by its design is culturally relevant. If I have a Latino student and they are going out and doing this, likely they are going to find a Latino who served in Vietnam. They're going to have a deeper personal connection. There's going to be stuff that comes out of that that will not come up if I just assign them a reading sample. So this is just an example of this shift towards student-centered, away from just the pure standards-based, more towards student-centered. In my opinion, and because I've seen this work in schools, this is critical to equity. We have to focus in on the student. That's how we honor who they are. So as we consider this and we move on, now we think about implementation. So we've discussed in the strive towards actual equity, we've discussed personalizing learning. We've discussed cultural proficiency. We may learn about these things, but the real question here is, do we have a leadership, a structure in place where we can implement on this every single day? And so successful implementation is based on the processes and practices of schools that have succeeded at supporting all students equitably. Schools have already pulled this off. We can look towards those and see the structures, the practices that they put in place. We can base an implementation of a school going through this process on success that already exists. So as we move through this, how might we structure a success, an approach towards successful implementation? This is where the equity framework comes in. And the equity framework is the focus of our next 3 webinars. So the equity framework is a concept we developed here based upon all these highly successful schools that we've witnessed. And what's interesting is as we were visiting these schools again and again and again, it was obvious these schools had a very overt front and center focus on building educational equity. But they made sure that they had addressed components of leadership, culture, and teaching and learning, or practice. I often refer to that section as practice. So leadership, culture, and practice. And they don't overemphasize the pedagogy which is needed on the practice side at the expense of culture. They don't overemphasize, building this rich culture without using leadership to make sure that it moves forward and succeeds. And so it's these three components working together that really lead toward that successful implementation. So the next webinar is based upon looking at leadership, and then we'll do culture, and finally we'll end on teaching and learning or practice. So I hope that you can join us on those additional webinars. This stuff matters. I mean, educational equity really is about the success of our students every single day. And so I end with this photo of my two children. Look at their happiness. How do we bring this type of enthusiasm into learning every day? How do we make sure that these beautifully unique kids who show up to school every day show up and they know they're represented? That's really our challenge here. It's an awesome, awesome opportunity for all of us. And I thank you for joining us on this learning journey. And I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Curtis. I just want to give people a chance to ask any questions they might have. I also want to launch a poll that you'll be seeing shortly. And so right now, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the questions feature, and we'll be sure to answer them. And we appreciate Curtis's time and all the information that's been presented. It's been excellent, excellent. So take a moment, fill out the poll, and then feel free to ask any questions you might have. Again, the presentation is being recorded, and so we'll be sending that out via email, and also the presentation will be sent via email. I'll also have a certificate of attendance for those who attended, and I will send that out via email also. Again, if anyone has any questions, they're more than welcome to ask them in the questions area. Great. I'm going to close the poll. Here's a question from Danae. How do you help teachers embrace the necessity to understand a student's culture? Some are resistant. Curtis, are you there? I don't believe Curtis can hear me. Let me just text him really fast. may have lost Curtis here. So hold on one second. I do appreciate the question. Well, Deneen, may have to get back to you on that.